All right, let's call to order the special Board of Education meeting of June 26, 2024. I have 6:30 PM. Why don't we begin with the Pledge of Allegiance? I think it's around the corner over there. To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Secretary, if you call the roll call, please.
Absolutely. Mr. Vinatieri? Here. Here. Mr. Daru? Here. Mr. Moses?
Here.
Ms. Knox?
Here.
Mr. Green?
Here.
Ms. Berkmeyer?
Here.
And Mr. Richards is here.
I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda as is presented.
So moved.
Seconded.
A motion by Ms. Knox, supported by Mr. Vinatelli. Any questions or comments? Mr. Secretary?
Ms. Knox?
Yes.
Mr. Vinatieri?
Yes.
Mr. Richards is a yes. Mr. Moses?
Yes.
Mr. Daru? Mr. Green?
Yes.
And Ms. Berkmeyer?
Yes.
All right, item D on the agenda is hearing of the public. Those who wish to address the board on agenda items must complete a brief request stating their name, address, and subject of their comments. Remarks about specific employees should be directed to them personally and not included in the public forum. Administration will follow up with concerns within 48 hours of the board meeting. I do not have any requests to speak. So as such, we will move on to item 2, 2024-25 budget hearing. This hearing is being held to conform with the state legislation amended section 16 of the Uniform Budgeting and Accounting Act. Budget hearing was publicized in the local newspaper, and we will hold the meeting open for questions and discussion on the 2024-25 budget and tax millage rate. I believe that takes us over to Mr. Rathbun.
Good evening. We'll pull up the presentation here. Okay, so tonight we have a public hearing in order to share our original budget. We'll also talk about our current tax millage levy and our current tax base so that we can meet all the requirements for the public hearing. So I'll have you go to the first slide, if you will. Okay, so here we have our 2024 taxable values. You can see our non-homestead operating. So that's what we levy our operating millage on. And that would be 6 mills for all residents. And then if you have a business, you would have a larger levy of 18 mills on those particular items. You can see the non-homestead operating base increased $30 million or about 9.85%. And that'll become important as we talk about the Headley rollback. So kind of keep that number in mind, 9.85. On all the properties, we levy 10 mills of debt service, and that you can see increased about 125 million or 7.68% from last year. Next slide. The reason those percentages are important is if we have a Headley effect come into place, a Headley rollback, if you will, and that's what happens is when the taxable values are going up faster than the rate of inflation, you can have what's called a Headley rollback. And essentially what that does is it reduces the number of mills that we can levy. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here. We did have a Headley rollback on our operating for this year, as well as our, we would have had a tax rollback as well for the truth in taxation, but because we're having this meeting, we're able to avoid that rollback. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're at right now with our current levy and then the Headley effect that we have for the 24-25 school year. So You'll remember back in November of 2019, the voters approved a 2 mil restoration. We had been rolled back so many times that we weren't even able to levy our full 18 mils. So we went back out to the voters and asked for a 2 mil restoration. They approved that. And so we've been levying portions of that to be able to make sure that we're levying the full 18 mils. So we've got about 1.9057 mils remaining available to the district to levy in the 2024-2025 school year. The millage restoration provides a hedge against Headley. So as things roll back, if we've got extra millage kind of set on a shelf, we can then take that off to make sure that we're levying the full 18 mils. As I said, there was a millage rollback this year. The reduction was 0.9891. So it takes whatever millage we're levying. If we're levying 18 mils, it would reduce that. You would multiply it by that 0.9891, and that would be the max you could levy. Fortunately, as we talked about, we have that kind of extra millage that we can pull down. And so we are able to levy the full 18 mils this year. Also want to just remind everyone on November 7th, 2023, voters approved a new operating millage. That millage will be for 19.4687 mils. Now we can only levy 18 of those mills at a given time. So we can't levy that full millage, but that the additional over and above the 18 mils will kind of be on a shelf. And then as we need those, as we have these Headley rollbacks, we can take a little bit of that off the shelf to get us up to the full 18 mils. So it's really, like we said, a hedge against that rollback, if you will. That will begin in 2025. So not this coming year, but the following year. And then it will remain in place for 10 years going to 2034. Okay, if you move to the next slide. I mentioned this a little bit, the truth in taxation. So there's another rollback that can occur if we don't have a meeting like this. And so this is the opportunity we have to provide by regulatory effect. We have to provide this meeting to avoid this truth in taxation rollback. And this really talks about any increase in the total value of the existing taxable property could subject you to a truth in taxation rollback. But by having this meeting and special vote of the legislative body, which will be on the budget later for the 24-25, we're able to avoid that rollback. It is our intent this year to levy homestead of 18 mils, non-homestead, I should say, and the debt retirement is exempt from the truth in taxation. So next slide. So you can see, as we talked about, this year we're planning on levying 18 mils for our operating, and so that goes along, and that's really going to be primarily on businesses within our school district is the full 18 mils. Homeowners are not subject to that particular 18 mils. They pay a 6 mil that goes to the state, and that is the same for everybody in the state of Michigan. All regular taxpayers that don't have a business are subject to that 6%. And then we'll also levy 10 mils for our debt retirement. So whether you're living in Chesterfield, New Baltimore, you're going to pay the 10 mils for debt, and you would pay the 6 mils to the state for a total of 16. If you're a business, that's when you're going to pay the 18 non-operating homestead millage along with the 10 debt mils. So you can see that total of 28 mils there. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is our proposed budget for 2025. And obviously there are a number of assumptions that go into this. We're also don't have strong numbers right now from the state of Michigan. We've got several proposals from the governor, the House, the Senate. They are working right now to come together and provide a budget for us, but we're kind of operating a little bit on some of the earlier presentations from the House, Senate, and governor. So I'll be focused on the final two columns you see in blue and yellow there. One is 23-24, our projected ending budget. And then I'll be comparing that, contrasting that to the 24-25 original budget that we proposed for the board to pass tonight in their regular meeting. So you can see the local sources pretty much the same, about $44,000 difference. We have local sources in our 24-25 of about $8.3 million. Our state sources just under 64 million. That's an increase of about 925. The vast majority of that is one of the assumptions we have in our budget is that coming from the governor is that we would have a $241 increase in the pupil foundation. That is still up for debate. That might change. We've seen some stuff recently today that might change. There's also a few categoricals that we had in 23-24 that we know will not repeat themselves in 24-25. So we've adjusted for those. Our federal sources, you can see, changed significantly. So in 23-24, we had $6.5 million of federal sources. Next year, we're projecting only $837,000. The big change there is that we have both our ESSER grant, our 11T grant, those were both related to COVID, out of the ARP plan that was passed by the federal government. Those are both going away for next year, so we won't have those monies. There's also been a change at the ISD where they are swapping out federal special ed money that we used to receive, IDEA B, which was about $2.4 million. They're swapping that out and giving us regular tax receipts that they get from the levy that the ISD does. And so it's just, we're swapping federal money for local money. And you'll see that on the next line. So you see where it says other sources. So in there, you've got a couple of things. One would be that tax swap that we were talking about. We would also have our local millage that the ISD levies for the supplemental millage. So those things are both in there. And so then moving on to the expenditures, you can see for instruction, we're about flat. We've got a little bit of a decrease this year. A big portion of that is we are done with the buyout in 23-24. So we spend almost $700,000 on the buyout that we won't spend next year. So even though that looks like it's flat, we're actually spending a little bit more on instruction, on actual instruction within the district, as opposed to the teacher buyout that we put in place several years ago. Then kind of moving down, you can see we are planning an additional in support services, operations, pupil transportation, and so forth. We're looking at spending about $31 million there. So those two, instruction, 31 million on operations, will bring us down to about $79 million that we're planning to spend. So, one of the things I want to point out, though, is that $47 million in instruction, that's roughly 60% of our budget is being spent in the classroom, which is actually a really good barometer of the expenditures. Anything north of 60% is a good number in terms of what you're spending in the classroom. So I feel good about that. You can see there that we're projecting revenues over expenditures of about $2.8 million. Now, part of that 2.8, I should have probably mentioned this up in the other sources and transfers above, and the revenue where we have that $9 million figure. We also have budgeted for the sale of Sugar Bush. So that is included, that $2.8 million is included there. So when we come down to the revenue over expenditures or surplus, you can see there we're just over $2.8 million. I'm actually really proud of that number. I think I'm really happy that we're there. You know, a lot of districts were talking about the ESSER funding cliff, right? And when we don't have those federal monies, we're going to have to lay off all these people. And what are we going to do with, you know, how are we going to be able to continue to fund all of these initiatives that we had if we don't have all that federal money? And a lot of districts were really worried about that ESSER cliff. I feel like, you know, we've been able to kind of manage this in where we will be flat, take out the $2.8 million sale of Sugar Bush, and we would be relatively flat, being able to afford all of those interventions, all those additional positions that we've implemented, the additional social workers, the support, the counselors, all that additional support. We've been able to incorporate that into the budget and be able to fund those positions without that federal money. So I feel like this has been a lot about what we talked about in the finance committee, and what we were projecting has kind of come to fruition. So I feel good about that. You can see there that if we add that to our beginning balance of just under $12.8 million, we will end the year projected at $15.6 million. Now that is roughly 19.69%. I know the board has indicated, at least in some conversations in committee and so forth, that you may want to reserve a portion of that $2.8 million from Sugar Bush for other capital projects. That would be at the option of the board to do that. It's just a reservation that the board can make during a regular board meeting. And if that is the will of the board, we'd be happy to put that resolution together in the future for the board. All right, so I'll run through on the next slide. I maybe have touched on a few of these, but I'm gonna kind of go through some of those assumptions that we talked about and touched on earlier. So we're projecting a decline of 50 students for next year. We think based on current enrollment trends, that's probably still pretty conservative. That does not necessarily include some of the early childhood that we're hoping to attract. That membership will result in loss of about $500 million or $500,000. Geez, get my commas in the right place there. Increase in foundation of about 241, like we talked about. That would increase our foundation by about 1.2 million. Our local tax revenues went up. We talked about that a little bit earlier about how our tax bases have increased, and therefore we'll earn a little bit more in local tax revenue. We've increased some of our 31A funding. When we were receiving that grant in prior years, we're using our ESSER money to fund a lot of that supplemental supports, tutors, and so forth. And so we've had that kind of stashed away, and now we're pulling that back out to be able to afford all of those people under our at-risk grant. Like we talked about, decrease in ESSER, decrease in 11T. We have our 31O, which was kind of all the support staff, counselors, social workers, all those folks that we were getting money for. We won't be getting that same money going forward. You can see their enhancement millage is increased by about $211,000. And we touched on the special education millage. We also had some insurance claims from last year that we don't expect or hope we don't have this year. That was the flooding of our gymnasium at the high school. We don't want to go through that again. Then we talked about the sale of Sugar Bush. So those are kind of the big hitters in terms of the change in funding. Kind of next slide, if you will. Some of the expense changes that went into that budget that we just kind of covered is we've increased some of our educational initiatives by about $400,000. So that would be increased textbooks and other online access licensing for the textbooks and other educational initiatives. We had an increase in compensation of about $1.4 million from our negotiated contracts. We also had some staff reduction this year through attrition of about $650,000. We've added a few positions. We've added a director of data assessment. We've budgeted for a restorative coach. We've added an ROTC instructor, and we've added a couple custodial staff, knowing that we're going to have more square footage to clean at the high school and some of our other buildings. We kept our MIPSers flat. That's one of the areas where it's really in flux right now. We could get a pretty significant change there. So we've kept that flat for right now, but one of the big conversations that's out there right now is related to the retirement benefit and how much schools have to pay for that. That particular piece of the retirement plan is overfunded. And so there's some discussion about changing the current law, current regulations to allow for the state and the schools not to contribute to that as long as it's overfunded. So that could change quite a bit. It could be up as much as 7% of our revenues, which would be, or I'm sorry, our salary expense, which would be significant revenue in the form of a savings to us. We've increased all of our health insurance hard cap increases. As I talked about, the early retirement buyout is complete. You may remember 4 or 5 years ago. Doesn't seem that long ago, but it's been that long. 4 years ago, I think we did a buyout for our teachers, and the last payment for that buyout was completed in 23-24. So that was pretty substantial. We're going to have additional costs in our maintenance and operations. We're looking at some increased cost in dual enrollment, which allows students to enroll at the university level as well as being enrolled here at Anchor Bay. New band uniforms. So we've put in about $200,000 for new band uniforms for next year. General liability, like everything, our workers' comp insurance has gone up despite the fact that we have very low rates and very low loss amounts. We're looking at an increase about 50,000. And then cybersecurity, we've added about $35,000 to be able to contract with an outside entity that will help us improve our cybersecurity, and so we don't have any buddy taking over and ransomware the district for money. So next slide, please. You can see there again, like we talked about, take you back a little bit to 2019-20 at 2.93%. We were being monitored by the state at that point in time. Good news is we've now worked our way up to about 19.69%. So that is a very healthy fund balance. We've talked about in the past, 15% is really an important number for us. Kind of based on our current payroll and our current revenues and so forth, our reserves, we always felt like 15% was the right number because that was a number that meant we did not have to borrow for the state aid note. And our intention is not to borrow for state aid note this year. That'll be the first time we've not had to borrow for that here at Anchor Bay since I've been here, and probably quite some time before that. So just another testament to our current financial stability. I'd be happy at this point to take any questions if you have questions.
Any of the board members have any questions?
I do have a couple. You touched upon it a little bit already around the different mills by city. I know a couple weeks ago, there were some questions that different cities, different townships, and the mills that go towards schools and things like that. Can you walk us through how the mills portion of that works?
Yeah, I can. So for somewhat, I'll try. So Anchor Bay leveraged the same amount of mills like we talked about earlier. We levy the same amount of mills on Chesterfield, on New Baltimore, any folks that live within our catchment. We levy the exact same millage. Now the millage may differ between a resident from New Baltimore and Chesterfield for reasons beyond the school. So for example, I think the operating millage that New Baltimore levies is roughly 9 mills higher than what Chesterfield, depends on fire, police, all of that is a part of the levy that folks get. So really you would have to look at your tax bill in detail to see kind of what those mills are, because usually your tax bill will list out exactly what you're paying for and how many mills. And that would be the best way to understand, exactly where your mills are going. But for most residents who don't have a business, who live in our district, they are going to be subject to the 6 mills that the state collects. They're also going to be subject to the 10 mills of debt that we collect. So, but that would really be the extent of the money that's coming to the district. And that would be the same regardless of what local government entity you reside in. There could be, like I said, other taxes. There could be Chesterfield might be levying more mills for fire, more mills for police. It could, it just depends on the jurisdiction and what they're levying.
just to reiterate one more time. The school mills are the same, whether I live in New Baltimore, Chesterfield, or any other community that we service.
Yes, that is.
Per
that-
mill.
That is correct.
Okay,
That is correct.
so it's the same.
Did I answer? I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hearing none from the board, is there anyone in the audience who may have a question? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the special Board of Education meeting to be in compliance with state legislation.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. Knox, supported by Mr. Moses. Any questions or comments? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Meeting adjourned. We will start in 4 minutes on to our regular board agenda.